Okay, so tonight's class, we're going to continue where we left off from last week when we talked about collectives and the individual, and we're going to move this into the subject of transactions and how wealth is distributed and how we pay taxes. And I'm just going to try to break this down into principles and things that would be maybe axiomatic and just kind of discuss some of these things. Um, Last time I talked about 5 kinds of transactions. That's how we ended. The first one was capitalism. The second one is charity. The third one is theft. The fourth one was redistribution. And the fifth one was something I've been thinking about a little bit more recently. And it's sort of this Robin Hood vigilante kind of thing where, the rich people or those who are in power are corrupt, and the poor little guy is a victim of corruption, and so vigilantes step forward, and it's a good thing to rob from the rich and give back to the poor. And we're kind of seeing some of that today with BLM and some of the Occupy Wall Street and all these people that are protesting, claiming the system is broken, it's unfair, it's the rich people are criminal, and it's kind of an interesting thought. And then the last thing I want to talk about, because this also ties to how wealth is distributed, is taxes. And so we'll talk a little bit about systems of taxation that might be fair or not fair. We'll just talk about that a little bit. All right, so let me start with capitalism. So I think if we're going to talk about capitalism, we really have to start with the idea that we all have freedom of thought. Okay, so we all get to think whatever we want to think. I can not like someone, I can like them. It's all happening inside of my head, my brain. Nobody has a right to force their way of thinking into me, right? We would all look at that as evil, brainwashing, indoctrination. We all have a right to think things, whether they're good thoughts or bad thoughts. And based on our freedom of thought, we have a right to also act on our thoughts. Of course, as long as our actions don't harm someone, or make someone pay for my actions, like if I do something irresponsible, then I should have freedom to act on my thoughts. And this is my life, it's my time. If I choose to work, a certain amount of time and to create something of value, I own it. It's my time, it's my thought, it's my decision. If I work to create something, like simple example might be, suppose I can make chairs. I'm great at working with wood, and I make really exquisite chairs. Well, if I decide to work and make a chair, and that chair maybe is of value to someone else, I could go and trade that. I've done some work. Here's a chair. It has a certain amount of value. Maybe I make a bunch of chairs for myself, and so my house has all the chairs now that I need, and but I want to keep making chairs, and maybe other people would like to have my chairs. Well, so that chair has a value that I want to trade for something that someone else might have created with their work. And in the fairest situation, just imagine you're back thousands of years ago in a very primitive society, and people would come to trade things that they have created, have produced. And so you might bargain with someone. I made some chairs. You maybe make clothes. Okay, well, I need clothes. You need chairs, and we could negotiate. How much clothes is worth like one chair, and we go back and forth. And ultimately, nobody forces me to trade my chair for your clothes. Nobody forces you to trade your clothes for my chair. We reach some agreement. Both of us are happy that it's a fair exchange, and we make a trade. And that's a good thing, right? Both parties are happy. I didn't know how to make clothes, and the other person didn't know how to make chairs, and now we both get to have clothes and chairs, and it's a good thing. The only thing that is important is whenever a trade like this is made, it has to be fair, right? So I can't sell you a chair, but I know, that this chair is going to break. It's made so poorly that it's cheap and it's going to break and it's really worthless. I'm cheating you, right? If I sell you a bad chair like this. And so we need to have some sort of regulation to make sure that trades are done fairly. Well, who does that? It's the collectives that we belong to. So in our society, we need to have regulations that insist that when we make trades, we're not cheating each other. And if some sort of cheating is caught, then someone has a right to take it to a judge and ask for justice. So that's all has to be built into this idea of free trade. Now, another example might be two people that live near each other, next to each other. One's a farmer, the other's a rancher. Well, the farmer grows food, and the rancher has livestock. And if I can trade some of my like grain for some of your livestock, now we both get to eat vegetables and meat, and it's better for everyone. And again, in the old days, you would just kind of negotiate. I'll give you this much grain, and you give me 2 chickens and a goat, and we'll call it a deal. Kind of thing. But that gets to be pretty hard, right? You don't want to have to always bring your wares to trade it to someone who needs what you have that also has what you have. It's very hard, right? I might need some very kind of unique things, and it's hard to find the people that are producing those things. And so society realized all of this, of course, and they said what we need is a way to score the value of our work. And we'll call that currency, money. So if I do some work, I produce something of value, we score it, right? This is kind of the familiar theme in all the things that we're talking about. How do we form scores? Well, there's a score that's formed to evaluate the value of something that you've produced. And as long as everybody's happy with the transaction, so like I'll go to the store and I'll say, here's an item that I would really like. How much does it cost? And the price of that product is essentially the value. I think to myself, well, I have to work so much. Here's how much money I have, right? And I'm hopefully the work I've done is fairly scored, and I make a fair amount of money for the work that I do. And now I can trade that for work someone else has done and make a trade. And I can go to a store now that has all kinds of things. I don't just have to go to my neighbor or someone, a specialist who produces only the one thing, and hopefully they want what I produce. Now we have a much more flexible way to make these trades, and it's all good. My father used to tell me, he was an engineer and he loved engineering. He was an engineer's engineer. My father was, if he was on Star Trek, he would have been Scotty. Just loved engineering. And he was so good at it that eventually he got promoted, and eventually he became a project manager, and now he had responsibilities to meet with the customer, write proposals, and the focus shifted from engineering to bringing in money. And it was at that point in my father's career that he began to not really like engineering so much. He had sort of left his first love. And there's a problem with free trade when businesses or people with things to trade are not so much focusing on providing goods and services that have value, but rather how can I make as much money from the transaction? That's when real problems start happening. When you take your focus off of producing value and instead focus on profit, that's where corruption begins to happen. That's the motivation for why people might cheat in a transaction. So capitalism is really all about each of us, with our own free will, choosing to work to produce goods and services that are of value to others. And in a sense, at the heart of capitalism is serving others. and we're rewarded for that. It's actually a very beautiful thing. If capitalism was done in its purest form, we're all working to serve each other and getting rewarded by how well we serve each other. That's a pretty good system. It gets corrupted when you take your eye off of producing value and instead focusing on making money, because that leads to corruption, to cheating, to manipulating. It leads to, for example, corporations trying to turn into monopolies, trying to squash other corporations that might compete. And all of these things, when you take your focus off of producing value, will corrupt capitalism. Now, capitalism is very interesting because you can step back and ask, well, how do we value the goods and services that we might produce when we're working? And there's a lot of problems with that because a lot of people think they're underpaid. Sometimes it's actually true. They're abused in their jobs, underpaid, and maybe put into dangerous situations. And so people form unions to complain and maybe protest. And the companies, a lot of them are, the bottom line is making profit. They have to, answer to a board of directors. And, the bottom line is profit and loss. And you can see that things begin to have problems because sometimes the corporations are focused on profit instead of producing value. And the workers are treated potentially unfairly, or sometimes they're actually treated fairly, but they just want more. And you have potential problems. Now, there's another serious problem with trade, and this is between collectives. So think about trade that occurs between countries. Okay, so imagine two countries, one that can produce gold. They have gold mines, and so their big thing is their workers go into the gold mines and dig out gold. And another country produces a lot of food. And so this country that produces food says, I'll tell you what, let's make a trade. I'll sell you food and you give me gold. Okay, so let's figure out what's a fair trade. You really need food. Your people will starve if you don't have food. And we have plenty of food for ourselves here in our country, so we'll feed our people, but with whatever we have left over, which let's hope is a lot, we'll sell it to you and you give us gold. So what ends up happening over time is the country that's producing gold gives all their gold to the country that's producing food. The people that are buying the food, they eat the food and it's gone. And after many, many years goes by, there's nothing of lasting value in the country that was producing gold. Maybe they ran out of gold now, their gold mine is empty. And the other country now has all of the gold. And the other country is still producing food. They don't have any problem feeding their people, but now they own all of the gold. And what they can do with that gold is, let's say, buy the land in the other country and basically take over the other country. They can buy the businesses. They can basically take it over. And you have to realize that when there's trade, you have to talk about sort of perishable goods and services versus more permanent ones that last a lot longer, right? So one of the problems that we have in the world is we're all trading with each other, but a lot of the stuff that one country might buy is all perishable. And what the other country is buying is stuff that's not perishable, perhaps gold, diamonds, even money. They get all the money. And in the end, okay, a country needs to eat, but they're selling themselves out. And it can be a real problem. And we see all kinds of problems with trade. But there's another problem too that is even more hideous with all of this. And I've talked about this before, but I want to kind of go back and, kind of remind us all, we all know this, that life isn't fair. None of us got to choose when in history we would be born. We didn't get to choose what country we would be born in. We didn't get to choose who our parents would be, so we didn't get to choose our genes. We didn't get to choose whether we would be male or female, and all kinds of things, that we didn't get to choose, like how tall would I be? Would I be tall or short? Would I be fat or skinny? Good looking, not so good looking? Would I be good at sports, or would I not be so good at sports? Would I be good at math? Would I be not be so good at math? And we all know this, that we enter into this world all with unique abilities. And a lot of it has to do with our genetics. Now, we can try to get good at things that we don't have natural ability in, but clearly we're at a disadvantage if we're competing with someone who's gifted. No matter how hard a person who is tone deaf tries, they can't become a great singer. I mean, we've all watched American Idol with these people who are delusional about their singing ability, and it's painful to listen to them sing. And other things in music. There are people that absolutely have no sense of rhythm. They can't clap on the beat. And then there are people that have amazing, sense of rhythm. They can do complex time signatures, and it's we're just all different all over the place. And the problem with this is what seems to be happening in our world. If you compare how the world was, let's say 150, 200 years ago, you could have two farmers side by side. One's brilliant at math and educated, and the other farmer is uneducated, not too bright. It really doesn't matter. Both are out there working hard in the field. They grow their crops. Everyone kind of knows what you have to do to grow your crops. There's no technology or anything brilliant that you have to do to be successful. You're out there in the field, working hard. It really doesn't matter so much your education. But in today's world that's high tech, what seems to be really happening is a lot of the high paying jobs are going to people that have, strong educations. The people that get paid a lot are the people that have amazing skills in certain areas, and that requires oftentimes a lot of education. And the people that don't seem to, uh, have the college degrees, maybe not even a high school degree, end up having, what you would call unskilled labor type jobs, minimum wage types of jobs. And you could say, this isn't fair. How come, somebody was gifted with brains, or maybe they came from a household that had enough money to pay for them to go to college? All kinds of things that affect our ability to be educated. Maybe you live in a bad area with bad schools. There's no discipline, perhaps, in some of the schools in some of the, urban areas. But for whatever reason, we don't enter life, in any sense of fairness. We all have different abilities, and those abilities are going to affect our ability to earn an income. So someone who's just, not really gifted in academic kinds of things, in doing things that require significant intelligence, they're going to end up with a low-paying job, most likely. And the people that are really gifted, that maybe they get good grades in school, but they don't even have to work hard, end up getting high-paid jobs. And is this fair, right? We enter into this world, our bodies are, what they are. We're good at things and not so good at other things. And that affects our ability to earn an income. The problem all begins when we start saying, hey, wait a minute. This is the social justice group sort of collective that I belong to. I belong to, some collective based on my race or my religion or my gender, whatever you want, it is. And you say, now I look at the statistics of my collective, and we're not doing as well as some other collectives. That must be racism. It must be, prejudice. And we start, claiming that there's some kind of injustice that's done towards us. And the problem is when we identify with the collectives that we belong to. It's not reasonable for a person to say it's not, look how unfair life is because I'm not getting paid as much money as, let's say, a brain surgeon or an engineer or, someone in medical, research science or something like that. These jobs really take rare intelligence to be able to, to do these kinds of jobs. And the person, so they're very valuable. And the person who didn't even graduate high school, who can barely do arithmetic, can't be complaining, how come I have a minimum wage, unskilled labor job? On the other hand, so here I am, PhD in physics. I do supercomputing work. I'm kind of a world-class expert in some of these areas. And I sit in a comfortable room that has air conditioning or heating, depending on, if it's hot or cold outside. And I'm in a comfortable chair working on a computer all day long, and I get paid a lot of money. And then there's someone out in the hot sun, like working on a roof or digging a ditch or building roads or doing some really difficult job, getting minimum wage, and they're breaking their back. Is that fair? Getting paid minimum wage, doing back-breaking work. So there's kind of a problem here. And you can see the tension, right? The people that aren't getting paid as much as someone else might complain. How come, this person's, in a comfortable office and I'm breaking my back and I'm not getting paid very much? That's not fair. And maybe it's not fair. But the problem, and this is kind of at the root of capitalism, is supply and demand. The smartest people, most educated, are getting those top jobs, and you know, uh, meanwhile, there's such a glut of people that aren't really skilled in those kinds of jobs to do all the other jobs. And you don't have as much demand, right? It's pretty easy to hire unskilled labor. It's not so easy to hire a world-class expert who's going to, be the key to make your company or whatever it is that you're doing, thrive. I remember Steve Jobs once said, I heard him in an interview, and he was saying software is the most unusual industry because every other industry, you look at like the best versus, let's say, the average, and it's not that much difference. Like, for example, imagine a taxi cab driver. The best taxi cab driver is maybe slightly better. Maybe they drive a little safer. They know slightly better routes to get you to your destination a little quicker, maybe, than the average. But it's not that different, really. On the other hand, you look at software, and the top software people are 100 times more valuable than your average software person. It's the top software guys that are, they're changing the world with their ideas and algorithms and breakthroughs and all that. And I think, in a lot of these fields, especially software or engineering, medicine perhaps, where the top people are just so much more valuable than the average person. And you see all of this disparity in pay. And so here we are in a world of capitalism where it seems so fair. If you go back in the old days, I have a farm, I grow some food, you have a ranch, we work hard, we exchange, we're all happy. It's so fair, and yet you realize there are potential problems. And another problem in capitalism is what happens when somebody or a business gets so rich that they can begin to manipulate the system. They can potentially ensure which political candidates get elected. So they're funding their campaigns with obvious kickbacks, with either tax breaks or somehow breaks that give them an advantage over their competition. And you can just see how corrupt that is as well. And so within this free trade kind of capitalist system, you've got to make sure that nobody gets so rich that the power that they have with that amount of money allows them to actually corrupt the system. And that's where you have monopoly, anti-monopoly type, you know, uh, legislation, right? To keep any one company from becoming so large that it can dominate the market and in an unfair way exclude the competition. And there's another thing that I think we all hate with capitalism, and that's the idea that you can form these dynasties where a family has so much money that they just continue to pass it on one generation after another, and they're just so rich that there's nothing you can do to stop it. And you begin having almost like a caste system within a capitalist system. So what do governments do? They say, all right, what we'll do is we'll have a death tax. So the government will at least take some of the estate to try to, well, the government just wants money. But in theory, the idea of an estate tax, a death tax, is to perhaps sort of slow down or stop this idea of dynasties. Um, I saw it was a picture, and I don't remember, it was from one of the Democrat, very far left kind of socialist persons, and they showed a picture of a mountain where two people are trying to climb a mountain, getting to the top, and the top is supposed to represent the American dream. And they were trying to show how unfair it is that someone is ahead of them, right? Why is it fair that we start life and someone's ahead of us climbing the mountain? Is that fair? And, I guess you could look at that in two ways. One is it's unfair. In a way, it is kind of unfair that someone would come from a rich family and they have an inheritance and they hardly have to do anything to get to the top of the mountain. And another person comes from a poor family and they're starting from the bottom of the mountain they have to climb. And you could also look at it as unfair, like suppose you started at the same place in the mountain, and one person has a strong, able body, and the other person is weak. They have no stamina. They don't have the strength to climb up the mountain. And obviously, the strong person gets up to the top, and the weak person can't do it. And it's a little bit like in our world, what if a person doesn't really have the skills or the ability? They just aren't, they don't have the brains or they don't have the physical strength or whatever it is, to really thrive in a capitalist society. Nevertheless, we keep going back to this idea that how can you say it's bad where somebody decides what they want to do, from their own free will. I'm going to do this job. It's going to create value. And if I work harder, I can create more value. Or if I work smarter, I can create more value. And I can trade that for value that someone else. And we just simply agree that it's a fair exchange, how can that be bad? It's a good thing. A fair trade, fair exchange is a good thing. But we have all kinds of problems also with capitalism. You remember I talked about the prisoner's dilemma. What happens when I'm trying to make a deal with someone? We're trying to do a fair exchange, but I don't care how the person I'm dealing with turns out. I'm just looking to get my best self-interest. This idea that when you make a deal, you're supposed to look after yourself, the other person's supposed to look after themselves. And of course, now instead of a fair exchange where I'm trying to do something where we're both, we're trying to make a deal where we're both equally happy, instead, I can start thinking, how do I make it best for me? Well, maybe if I start cheating, and maybe I have an inferior product, but I'm cheating the other person because I really only care about myself. The prisoner's dilemma is at the heart of the problem of capitalism, because if everybody it's one of the major problems with capitalism, because if I don't care about other people when I make a transaction with them, all I care about is myself, it's setting me up to cheat the other person. And if I'm not cheating, I could even, take this attitude of, it's their job to make sure they're getting a good deal. I shouldn't really care about the other person. That's their job to do that. That's the way the game is played. Imagine doing transactions like that versus, let's suppose a society where we both sit down and we say, all right, before we make this transaction, I want to make sure you have a good deal in this, and you should make sure I have a good deal. Let's make a deal that's equally good for both of us. So in other words, when I score my decision on the transaction, it's the fair scoring system where I add my score, but also to your score to form the total score, and we're trying to optimize that in some way. So the prisoner's dilemma is at the heart of problems with capitalism. But it's at the heart of problems with all systems when people are making decisions in their self-interest and not really caring what their decisions are doing to others. It always leads to a suboptimal, problematic society. All right, so capitalism is good. You make your exchange and you think it's fair, and it's all really good. It's very natural. We're all serving each other, right? But there are problems, as I said. What happens when people are left behind? Maybe you have an accident and you have your body. Like now you're in a wheelchair or with crutches, or something happens and you can't really. You need some help. Well, that's where charity comes in. And charity is also a very good kind of a transaction because, the giver feels good about themselves, right? I'm doing something good to help someone. And the recipient of the charity is grateful. Somebody who showed kindness to them. And it's a good kind of a transaction. Imagine we live in a capitalist society that's also filled with charity. Charity, of course, is something that we do that's selfless. I'm not giving to charity, um, you know, because it's going to reward me in some way. I give to charity because really, if I'm doing it right, it's because I care about the other person. In fact, the Bible kind of tells us the best kind of charity is when you give without, tooting your horn, da 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 da, look at all the charity I'm giving, right? The best kind of charity is actually, where nobody knows, what you're giving, and you don't even necessarily know who you're giving to. Certainly the person that you're giving the charity to doesn't, the best kind of charity is when they don't know it's you that's giving them the charity. You kind of ruin charity when you say, hey, look at this, I'm giving all this charity, aren't I great, and trying to get admiration from other people. That completely ruins the idea of charity, and the Bible teaches all of that. Anonymous giving is really the best kind of charity. And I remember years ago, I had a conversation with a coworker. Actually, this person was a government person who was my boss. I was a contractor, and she was running a project that I was supporting. And we were talking about religion and charity. And she said the only reason why people give charity, it's selfish because you want to feel good. And it's a selfish motivation. And I thought about that, and I thought I don't think that's right. At the time, I knew nothing about game theory or scoring. I didn't have the math equations, but I knew there was something not right. She was trying to be cynical, about Christians. Christians give to charity because it's really a selfish motivation so that they can feel good. Or the other side of it was so that they would get rewarded in heaven, and it was all a selfish motivation. Think about that. How many Christians do you know that give to charity because they want 10 times more back, in heaven? They're not doing it because they're trying to help someone else. They're doing it because they want a reward. And I don't know too many Christians that really think that way. But on the other hand, wouldn't it be pretty messed up if you're very charitable and then you go to heaven and God says, now, because you were charitable, I'm going to punish you for that, right? Obviously, you can't have sort of a collective, and now I'm talking about heaven, the kingdom of God. You can't really punish good behavior, right? That's not good. But do we really give charity as Christians because we expect a reward, or do we do it because our conscience tells us it's the right thing to do? Remember the math equations. Um, The conscience versus the flesh, right? My flesh says, oh, I want to keep my money. I don't want to give it to someone else. And my conscience says, which is the Holy Spirit working in us as Christians, says, oh, but this is really the right thing to do. You should do this. And what ends up happening, right, is when we're dominated by the Holy Spirit, we experience joy. It's sort of a byproduct. But the idea that I'm doing it because I'm selfish, that's a different term in the equation. It's important that's why, one of the reasons why when we look at those equations, remember, when we make decisions, there's a score for me and a score for everyone else that's affected by my decision. And how we weight those scores is defining kind of our selfishness versus our selflessness. Okay, so the weights in that equation is describing the selfishness. Well, I could, have maybe even a 0 weight for myself and a weight of 1 for the other person I'm giving charity to. That would mean I'm selfless, and I'm giving charity to them, and it's because part of it is maybe I have a servant's heart. I'm a selfless kind of a person, but also part of it is because of my conscience versus the flesh. My conscience wins out, and when I give, I experience joy. And it's part of the equation, but it's not selfishness. It's another byproduct. So giving to charity means, as a Christian at least, we experience joy, but it's not selfishness. I hope that makes sense, because I've heard a lot of people talk about that, and I think what they're kind of describing is they don't understand the experience of that joy that you have from serving God. And what else could it possibly be? Some selfish, fake kind of thing. And I think they're mixing up the equations. So charity is a good thing because the giver experiences joy, feels good, and the recipient is grateful. That's very different from redistribution, where a third party, like the government, through taxation, takes my stuff and gives it to someone else. When that happens, I'm upset. I'm not happy. My stuff was taken against my will. I didn't get to choose, like in charity, who I'm giving my money to or helping out. It was just taken from me by some, third party, the government, given to someone else. And the person that receives basically, the fruit of my labor doesn't feel grateful. They feel entitled. And you can just see how this completely ruins a society. People are upset, we're working hard, it's not fair. That I work hard and it's going to other people that maybe I look at it and I think they're not working so hard. They think they're entitled to my labor. It almost feels like slavery. I'm working hard and someone else is reaping the benefits. The Bible tells us that the person who won't work shouldn't eat. It's telling us if you're able to work, you should be working. And I think this whole kind of sense of redistribution is, I guess if you're sort of someone who doesn't want to work or work hard, it's good for you. You might think it's good for you, so you want that. But it's really a very unfair kind of exchange, right? If you go back into capitalism, I work, the other person works, we exchange something at a fair, exchange, and we're both happy. We're all serving each other and benefiting each other, living a better life. And charity is great because I feel good and the recipient feels good and we're helping each other. Obviously, charity, when it's fraud, is not good, right? So people who are, claiming they need help, but they're really able to work, but they're just not willing to work, or things like that. There are all kinds of fraud too. That's not good. So redistribution also has a problem because the politicians understand this. So the politicians love to carve out, the voters, and they say, okay, here's a whole bunch of rich people. We'll carve it out so it's only 1%. So 1% of the voters will hate me because I'm going to take their stuff and I'm going to distribute it to the other 99%, and I'll get elected every time because basically I'm Santa Claus. I'm promising the voters everything they want, and only 1% of the population hates me, you know. And of course, the politicians can't really deliver on all the promises, and so they always come up with some excuse. But essentially, what these politicians that are doing, that continually talk about redistributing the wealth, um, they're corrupt. They're bribing the voters, and the voters are corrupt because they're being bribed. This whole idea of voting your pocketbook goes back to the prisoner's dilemma. When we are making decisions, like for example, who to vote for, based on who's going to give me the best deal. I don't care about the rest of the country. I only care about me. That's the prisoner's dilemma again. I'm making choices that are selfish. And it that whole mentality leads to massive corruption because the politicians, like I said, they bribe the voters, and the voters are basically being bribed. And the politicians know they need money to run their election, so they go to the big businesses and the donors, and they say, "Hey, give me a whole bunch of money, and I'll make sure you do well." Right? So the business owners, are happy to support candidates that make sure that their businesses thrive, and the whole thing leads to corruption when you have redistribution. Redistribution, of course, is at the heart of Marxism, and Marxism has even more problems because, once the government gets powerful enough where they essentially take over everything, they, of course, persecute religion, they try to indoctrinate everybody, and it becomes really a tyranny. So the redistribution is not good. And theft is another kind of transaction where somebody, like a burglar or thief, breaks in, takes my stuff without permission. And of course, I'm unhappy with that. Maybe the thief thinks to himself, well, if this person, wasn't strong enough to protect their property or their money, then I have a right to it. And sometimes you'll even, hear people like, well, they have insurance, so I can, if I take it, it's just the insurance. All kinds of justifications, but the Bible tells us, thou shalt not steal. It's one of the 10 Commandments. And if you think about, that the Bible talks about stealing being bad, well, what would a thief steal? They're stealing property. And it implies that people can own property. Right? So this idea of redistribution, you really don't own property. It's all, let's say, owned by the government. The government gives you a place to live. The government, decides how much entertainment you're entitled to. All of this stuff, but you really don't own anything, including your time. That mentality of not having ownership is kind of at the heart of redistribution. And, there are some societies like, I think some of the ancient, like Indians, this idea of owning land, how can anybody own land, right? So they were kind of like nomads moving around with their tents, and, the land is just the land, it's nature. But nevertheless, even within like Indian cultures like that, they still owned property. You owned your teepee, you owned your bow and arrow, you owned your horses, maybe. It's hard to, you can't really, you could sort of see the idea of land maybe, but I think that's very fundamental to Western and Judeo-Christian thinking, that, you own the land. So you farm it, or you ranch on it, or whatever you do, and that's your land. You're responsible to work the land, and whatever you grow, you own that. But there has to be some way also of paying taxes, of exchanging that for other goods. And nobody has the right to just come and take your stuff. All right. Now, that leads us to kind of a final type of transaction or way of distributing wealth. And that's this idea, and I hadn't even really thought much about this until more recently, what we've seen with BLM and things like Antifa and things like Occupy Wall Street. This idea that somehow the system is corrupt, the rich people are rich, they've really stolen everything from the poor people, So for example, BLM would say, look, we were slaves and look at all the money the rich people made while we were slaves. We deserve reparations. And some of these rich people, their families are still rich today. That's unfair. And the money was stolen from them, or the wealth was stolen from them. And, here in America, most of us came to this country, our families came to this country as immigrants after slavery. And, for myself, my family, my relatives moved to this country in the early 1900s. Most of them were fleeing the pogroms in sort of, Eastern Germany, Russia, and Prussia, what would be called Prussia, that region where they were being persecuted. And so, the Jewish people fled that region of the world to come to America where they could be free. And my relatives came to this country with basically nothing but the clothes on their back. They were all poor, but they worked hard and tried to provide, a better life for their children. And the children grew up and tried to provide a better life for their children. And, most immigrants came to this country dirt poor, but tried to work hard to make a better life and achieve the American dream. And, especially myself, being Jewish, I've talked about this before. A friend of mine who basically, when he found out that I was not in favor of BLM as an organization, he lashed out on me. My friend was a black person, and he basically told me I was a racist, a white supremacist, probably a member of the KKK, and a Nazi. And I said to him, don't you realize I'm a Jew? I mean, first of all, my people were, slaves in Egypt under Pharaoh for 400 years. And, Jews hate slavery. The Jews aren't in favor of slavery. And my relatives that didn't make it out of, that Eastern Europe kind of region, they were put in cattle cars during, the Nazi Holocaust, taken to slave labor camps, either starved to death or put into gas chambers. I mean, my people have experienced slavery more recent, actually, than, the slaves, in America that were freed in the Civil War. And it was even worse because, the Nazis wanted to kill all my people. They didn't just want free labor, they wanted to kill us. How can you tell me I don't understand racism? He said to me, you couldn't possibly understand racism because you're not black. I'm like, what are you talking about? Even today, my people that live in Israel, are surrounded by neighbors who want to destroy them, and they blow themselves up to try to kill as many Jews as they can. It's unbelievable how much people hate Jews. And even growing up, I experienced anti-Semitism. KKK hated Jews every bit as much as they hated Christians or blacks. And even growing up, I experienced some of that. I was sort of called names. Um, but we have this thing in our society right now with like BLM, and somehow the system is rigged, and we should fight back. And you know what? If the system really was rigged, it would be a righteous fight. Nobody, reads Robin Hood, or, watches this, on TV or movies, the stories of Robin Hood, and says Robin Hood was the bad guy. It was always, the sheriff and the rich people, who were taxing the people to death, and, all the problems. Right? And so here we are in America, and there seems to be this counter-revolution that wants to take down America because they believe America is corrupt. It's systemic racism, injustice. And the question is that really true? If it were true, I would be right there with them. I mean, America kind of had a revolution because the king of Britain was taxing us without representation. It was an unfair system. And so we revolted. But today, is this really true? And of course, all the problems of capitalism, are exaggerated. All of the we're at a place now where we don't trust any of our institutions. All of us. I don't trust the media. I don't trust the news. I don't trust, the social media. We're told not to trust the police. They're all racists. I don't know if I trust the IRS. They seem to go after all of the Tea Party kind of groups. I don't trust the State Department. I don't trust the FBI. I don't trust the CIA. I don't trust the members of Congress. I don't trust our elections. I mean, it's like we're at a place where our country has been so stirred up, where almost everybody is looking at our country today thinking this thing is all messed up and we're at each other's throats. And, the question is it really true? At the heart of it is materialism. It really in the end all focuses on how did we distribute wealth? How come some people have a lot of wealth and some people don't seem to have a lot of wealth? They don't, maybe they're struggling. And something seems wrong, especially when you tie it to the collectives that you want to belong to. So we have social justice groups and cancel culture and all of this stuff that's happening. And I think it's important that we understand, each of these things, their strengths and weaknesses, to try to figure out what is the best way that we could have a utopian society where, we're maximizing the happiness of everybody, the joy of everybody. And I think the starting point is, remember we talked about charity and that when we're living kind of for God, we're experiencing God in our lives, we're filled with the Holy Spirit. Every day is a personal relationship with God, so we're experiencing joy. That is what gives us joy. It's not the material wealth. The material wealth makes us greedy. It makes us, selfish. Keeping up with, your neighbors, the Joneses, right? All of that. It causes us to covet. All of these problems come when we focus on materialism instead of God. And of course, at the heart of Marxist types of societies is that they completely turn away from God, even make believing in God or supporting religion a crime, because it's all focused on material. And because of that, they stir up the injustices, get everybody spun up so that the government has the power to distribute the wealth, but they actually have all the power to run everybody's lives. And it's a big, big mess. Don't we all want to be free to pursue our own lives the way we see fit? Doesn't that really mean that we should be responsible? Right? So who's responsible, for example, for my medical costs? Well, people are working. Shouldn't they at least try to be responsible for their medical costs? And okay, some people fall through the cracks. Well, couldn't we have charity to help them? But if I'm not responsible for my medical costs, if the government, somehow, takes the responsibility to make sure everyone has medical coverage, well, now the government will say, all right, since we're now paying for everything, we're going to outlaw certain behaviors, like you can't go rock climbing because that's dangerous and you might fall and hurt yourself and have big medical bills. You can't drink a soda that has too much sugar because that causes diabetes. And hey, if we're the government and we're paying for your medical bills, we can't have you doing things that will increase the cost. We only have so much money to pay for the medical coverage of everybody. And of course, when the government sort of takes care of everything, they actually get to make the decisions and we lose our freedom. If I want to compete in sports that are kind of risky, I might get injured. That's my call, but since it's my call, I have to take the responsibility to pay for that. Someone else shouldn't be paying for the risk taking that I'm, making. And if I decide, when I'm young to take drugs, to drop out of school, to not study hard, why does someone have to pay for me now that I've kind of ruined my life and I can't get a good job? Wasn't that my responsibility to make good decisions? Perhaps somebody will give me charity to help me get going again, but why should, the government take someone's money who was responsible and give it to someone else who wasn't responsible, maybe is abusing the system. And when they're not responsible, they actually kind of encourage it. So let me take a step back, and I want to talk, the last thing I want to talk about, I know we've gone kind of long, is taxes. And I just want to lay out two principles. And the first principle is something that in physics we would call time invariance. And time invariance basically says that a law of physics shouldn't really matter what time it is. The law, in physics, it's the same law regardless of it's today or tomorrow. The laws don't change. And one of the properties that comes out of time invariance, it's just kind of interesting in physics, is conservation of energy. You actually you can prove conservation of energy if you assume the laws of physics don't change in time. It's kind of an interesting concept. So here is something I'm going to throw out at all of you. And that is, why should the taxes I pay for some work that I do today have anything to do with work I've done prior to today? Okay? So if I've done a whole bunch of work, in the year, and I made a bunch of money, and the government says, well, based on what you did earlier in the year, now the work that you do today should be taxed at a higher rate because of the what do they call it, the tax rate that goes up the more you make money.
Graduated income tax.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I went blank. The graduated income tax. And it'll sound like on the video, the voice of God came in and helped me out. Thank you, God. Anyway, the graduated income tax, why should I be penalized for work I did in the past? Right? What if all I did was I worked one day, produced, back to my example of producing chairs. Let's suppose I produced 5 chairs, and that's the only day I work. Why should the taxes I pay on the days worth of work I just did have anything to do with work I did earlier in the year? That doesn't really make sense. Shouldn't the reward I get for the work I've done be based on the value I've created? And that's it. If I make 10 chairs, I've created twice the value as if I make 5 chairs. Shouldn't I be able to trade that and get 5 times as much back? Wouldn't it be fair that if there's some kind of taxes, that the taxation shouldn't like penalize me or reward me really, in either way? Wouldn't it just be fair that, okay, some percent of the revenue I made for the chairs I produced gets taxed, as an income tax? Now, property tax is a little bit different. Property tax, the more property I have, in a sense, the more, if I'm paying a property tax to pay for police or fire protection, or things like that, the more land I have or the more property I have, the more expensive it is for the government to sort of provide services that will protect my property. So that kind of makes sense that property tax should be a flat percentage. I shouldn't be paying more if I have more property or graduated more. That doesn't really make sense. These ideas of wealth taxes, that are based on, well, you have more so you can pay a higher rate, that kind of doesn't make sense with property tax. And there are also fees that are part of taxation. So for example, if I go to a park, and I want to use the park, or I go to a government, museum, maybe it makes sense. I pay a fee to go to the museum, to pay for some service actually that the government is providing to me. So there are fees, there are property tax, there is income tax, which I believe income tax, the only way to be fair is to think of it as time invariant, that whatever I do to earn anything, it should be based on the value, and a taxation should be based on the value I've created. And it should have nothing to do with anything I've done in the past. And if I produce twice as much, the only thing that would be fair is I pay twice as much taxes on income. There's one more kind of tax called sales tax. And Sales tax is a pretty fair tax. It's flat. You go to McDonald's and you buy a hamburger, and I don't know, let's say you pay $5 for a hamburger. And then let's suppose you say, well, I want to buy two hamburgers. And the person there says, well, since you're rich enough to buy two hamburgers instead of $5, two hamburgers is $15. And you'd say, well, wait a minute. This doesn't make sense. I mean, if anything, I'm buying in volume. Wouldn't it be cheaper for you to make me two hamburgers than just one? Why am I paying $15 for two hamburgers? The person says, well, that's the way it is. So then you'd probably say, well, all right, I'm going to buy one hamburger, and then, oh, I'm going to buy one more hamburger for $5 each. And you can just see how ridiculous it would be to have kind of this, kind of escalated tax on hamburgers, on sales, the things that we buy. And so anyway, there's this world of taxation. There's kind of a way of paying taxes, right? That seems fair, and the sort of escalated kind of taxation seems unfair. And people have talked about, perhaps having a minimum income. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting thought. Everybody gets at least a bare minimum income so that nobody's starving in the streets, kind of a safety net sort of thing. And there's a part of me that kind of likes that, but the part of me that doesn't like that is you're paying people to not work. And it's kind of encouraging people that might take advantage of the system to just simply not work. What is really the solution to all of this? And I think it goes back to the good distribution mechanisms. We had capitalism, that as long as we have fair trade, that's a good thing. And we have charity, that's a great thing. If we could have a society that's dominated by free and fair trade, where everybody's focusing on producing value that they can trade, not so much focusing on profit, but focusing on producing value, a fairness of the trade, and charity, we would have an amazing society. So how could we bring that about? And I came up with an idea that I'll sort of end all of this with this idea. What if our government said, you can donate up to 25% of your revenue, of your income, to charity, and it would be a tax credit. Not a tax deduction, but a tax credit. And by this, what I really mean is charities that, let's just keep it simple, that help the poor. And these would have to be charities that are audited, they're transparent charities. There could be all kinds of corruption, but let's suppose we have a mechanism to make sure it's not corrupt. Let's suppose, just to make the numbers simple, let's suppose a person pays 50% of their income in taxes. Okay, we'll just look at federal and state income tax, okay, not sales tax. So let's say you make $100,000, you would have to pay $50,000 to the government in taxes. You would get to keep the rest of the $50,000 for yourself. Well, suppose there was a policy in place where you could donate 25% of that $100,000 to charity, any charity that you choose as long as it helps the poor, and it would be a tax credit. So instead of paying $50,000 to the government in taxes, in income tax, you would pay $25,000 to the government in income tax, and then you would be able to delegate $25,000 to your favorite charities. You still get to keep $50,000. But now what's happening is people would be giving to charity. Now, if you want, you can still give $50,000 to the government and not give anything to charity. But if you have the choice, when you pay your income tax, of donating 25% of what you would, or half of what you would have had to pay to the government, to the charities of your choice, wouldn't you prefer that to, just paying it all to the government and letting the government redistribute the taxes you pay? In other words, the government is the middleman to the charity, which makes me mad because I'm paying a bunch of money to the government against my will, and the people who are receiving my tax dollars feel like they're entitled to it. That kind of sets up a corrupt, kind of a bad society. Wouldn't it be better if everybody who paid taxes was forced to intentionally, or not forced, but it's obviously a good thing to think about charities that you want to give to and start becoming charitable. And then the people that are receiving the help would feel grateful. And here's an example of one charity that we could have. Suppose there was a charity that you could give to that would help people with pre-existing conditions or medical problems, and you could give to this charity that would help people with their medical bills. Wouldn't a lot of Americans do that? Why do we need the government to take over all of the medicine? Single payer. What if everybody paid, their medical insurance through their jobs? So I'm working, I'm paying for my medical, but someone who can't or doesn't make enough, they need some help, I can donate money into this charity that helps cover them. And now we've solved all of our medical problems. We don't need to, this would completely transform America. And think about that, what that would do to our culture, because it would shift us from being very selfish, from a government that was all into redistribution and all the corruption that goes with redistribution, to getting the government out of the charity business and we all become more charitable. Wouldn't that create a better society? All right, that's all I have to say for tonight's class. Let me pray real quick and then we'll open it up for discussion. Thank you, Lord, for all the insights you've given us on society and this whole idea of being able to score things and getting the insight on how the scores could actually be computed. I pray, Lord, for our country that we would not be corrupt. We would transform ourselves away from this whole entitlement mentality and the whole what I believe is mostly a fake Robin Hood kind of vigilante, protest, revolutionary, anarchist kind of movement, and help us to become more fair in our trades, help us to build each other up so that we're more capable, doing better in school, and providing a fair society where everybody who is able can work and produce things of value and receive a fair pay. But I also pray, Lord, that we would become more charitable. Perhaps it's your people, the church, that needs to set the example for this. And I just pray these things in your name. Amen. All right, we can open it up for discussion.